blood and legacy. One carried the empire's future, the other destroyed it. A thundering crack breaks the silence of a palace chamber. Moments later, a scream, muffled, desperate. Then silence. When the guards burst into the room, they find the Tsarevich, Ivan Ivanovich, lying in a pool of his own blood. His temple is caved in, his eyes, wide open, flicker with confusion and pain. Just feet away, Tsar Ivan IV stands frozen. His hands tremble. The heavy jewel-studded staff he used to strike his son now lies on the floor, stained crimson. The boy, his heir, is dying, and the Tsar is the murderer. This is not just a family tragedy. It is the unraveling of a nation. For Russia, this single blow would fracture its future and plunge the empire into decades of blood and ruin. But to understand how it came to this, to a father striking down his only competent heir, we must travel into the tormented mind of a ruler history remembers as Ivan the Terrible. He was crowned at 16, young, brilliant, and terrifyingly aware of the empire he inherited. Ivan IV Vasilievich, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, wasn't born a monster. But monsters are often made in the shadows of power, trauma, and betrayal. He came into a world of whispers and daggers. Orphaned at 8, raised in a court of predators, boyars, the old Russian nobility, jostled for influence, treating the boy prince like a pawn. He watched his mother die by poison. He saw men whipped, tortured, and murdered in front of him. And he learned one lesson: trust no one, love no one, fear, or be devoured. But Ivan was no fool. He read deeply: the Bible, military treatises, Greek philosophers. He spoke multiple languages. He modernized the army, codified laws, expanded Russia's borders further than any czar before him. He was, in every measurable way, a visionary statesman. And yet, his mind was a crumbling citadel. By his mid-30s, something inside Ivan had begun to rot. His mood swings were legendary, wild rages followed by tearful remorse. He would embrace a boyar one day, then order his skin flayed off the next. Contemporary accounts describe his eyes, sometimes sharp and calculating, sometimes vacant, like staring into a storm. What plagued him? Modern doctors speculate a toxic brew of factors. Osthold, neurological damage from untreated fevers in childhood. Chronic mercury exposure, a common component in Tsarist medicines and religious rituals. Possible schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, made worse by isolation and unchecked power. He was haunted by the ghosts of his youth, by visions of betrayal, by the creeping paranoia that everyone, even his son, was plotting against him. In 1560, the woman he loved, Anastasia Romanovna, his wife, died suddenly. Ivan was shattered. He accused his closest advisors of poisoning her. Whether true or not, her death was a rupture. From that moment, the terror began in earnest. He created the Oprichnina, a personal army of black-robed enforcers who answered only to him. They rode black horses, carried severed dogs' heads as symbols of loyalty, and turned Russia into a landscape of torture and suspicion. Whole towns were annihilated. Noble families were executed for imagined conspiracies. Priests were flayed alive. Ivan called it cleansing Russia of traitors. Others called it madness. But Ivan believed in divine mission. he was the Tsar by God's will. His enemies were demons in disguise, and any challenge, even from family, was a threat to the holy state. He would spend days in prayer and fasting, then emerged to sign execution orders by the dozens. He wept at altars, begged saints for forgiveness, then ordered children buried alive to punish their fathers. No one was safe. Not generals, not clergy, not commoners, not even his own blood. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, had watched all this unfold, had marched beside him in campaigns, had advised him on state matters, had obeyed, endured, loved. But he was growing stronger, bolder, and Ivan IV saw in that strength a shadow of his own, a challenge, perhaps even a rival. In the mind of a mad Tsar, love could mutate into fear, and fear into fatal fury. There's an old Russian legend. The Tsar is both shepherd and sword, but when the shepherd turns his blade inward, the flock bleeds. By 1581, Ivan IV had become both blade and butcher. His body trembled constantly, shaking hands, yellowed skin, bloodied gums. His mind splintered. He saw plots where there were none. He trusted no one, not even his most loyal son. He would pace the Kremlin halls at night, whispering to saints or to ghosts. He would speak to icons, asking if his son secretly cursed him. And when the icon remained silent, he struck. What began as suspicion would end in patricide. He was Russia's first crowned Tsar, a man of brilliance, devoured by darkness. And in that darkness, a prince would fall. He was born to rule, but never allowed to live. Ivan Ivanovich, son of the terrible Tsar, entered the world in 1554. His birth was met with celebration, cannon fire, and church bells. For a moment, there was hope. Hope that Russia would someday have a ruler both wise and merciful. A different kind of Tsar. From the start, he was different. Quiet, thoughtful, observant. While his father paced marble corridors in fits of rage, Ivan the Younger buried himself in books. Greek philosophy, military treatises, Orthodox theology. He spoke Latin fluently by 12. He studied government under Metropolitan Macarius, one of the empire's most learned clerics. He learned how to command, but more importantly, how to listen. Where his father ruled with fear, the prince inspired respect. The people called him Ivan the Good. And yet, he was always in the shadow of a madman. From the age of 5, he witnessed executions, staged like theater. Men impaled, boiled, flayed, punishments ordered with a whisper and carried out before supper. He watched as his father struck ministers across the face, beat servants for imagined slights, and talked to shadows as if they were counselors. But Ivan the Younger endured. He smiled when he had to. He spoke only when asked, because he understood. To survive in the Kremlin, one must move like smoke, seen but never grasped. Still, he could not remain invisible forever. By his late teens, the boy had grown into a man. Strong, articulate, and dangerously competent. He led troops during the Livonian Wars, negotiated minor treaties, and proposed reforms in state administration. Boyars admired him. Clerics blessed him. Even foreign envoys praised his intelligence. And Ivan IV began to fear him. It was subtle at first. Questions that once drew praise now drew silence. Requests for military command were delayed. Letters from allies were intercepted and read twice. The Tsar's eyes narrowed whenever his son entered a room. His body trembled, not with age, but with suspicion. He believed the boy might be plotting, might be another false Dmitri, a traitor. Of course, there was no plot. Ivanovich was loyal to the crown, to the church, and most tragically, to his father. But the Tsar's mind was too far gone to see love. In 1571, the prince married his second wife. The Tsar had already burned through a series of marriages, many ending in death, poison, or quiet disappearance. He viewed his son's domestic happiness with envy. Worse, the young Ivan began to question some of his father's decisions, especially the arbitrary executions and financial ruin of cities like Novgorod. Those questions would become fatal. Ivan the Younger did not seek a throne before its time, but he sought justice. And in a court ruled by madness, justice is treason. He was beaten more than once, not by enemies, but by his own father. Witnesses recount scenes where the old Tsar, in a storm of fury, would throw objects, lash out with canes, accuse the boy of betrayal, then collapse in tears. And each time, the prince forgave him. He told courtiers, "He is my father. I carry the crown he gave me." But forgiveness cannot mend a cracked crown. By 1581, Ivan Ivanovich stood at a crossroads. Russia was bleeding from endless war. The treasury was empty. The people feared both foreign armies and their own Tsar. And only the prince seemed capable of restoring order. Some whispered that he should take the crown early, that the Tsar should abdicate, that a new Ivan, one sane, one merciful, should lead. The prince refused. He would not steal what was his by birthright. He would wait. Even as his father circled closer each day, like a wolf testing the strength of his son's resolve. What do you do when the one you must honor is also the one who might kill you? Ivan the Younger had no answer. He wore his cross. He kissed the Tsar's hand. He prayed each night not for victory, but for peace. But peace is the one thing a tyrant can never trust. And soon, even his silence would be interpreted as rebellion. He lived in the shadows of the Kremlin, but in truth, he cast a light too bright to ignore. And in a world ruled by fear, light must be extinguished. Sometimes, it takes only the thinnest veil to unravel an empire. It was a cold morning in late November, 1581. The court moved with tense silence through the echoing halls of the Kremlin. Ivan the Terrible was in residence, his moods erratic, his health decaying, and his suspicions sharper than ever. In one chamber, lit by frost-filtered sun, stood Yelena Sheremeteva, the young pregnant wife of Ivan Ivanovich. Barely 17, beautiful, nervous, she had dressed quickly that morning. Her gown, though modest by modern standards, was considered light by the Tsar's increasingly strict expectations. Too revealing, too foreign, too dangerous. She was, after all, carrying Russia's future. And the Tsar saw treachery in everything, especially beauty. When he saw her, his face twisted. "You dress like a whore," he spat, voice cracking with fury. No one moved. No one dared breathe. Yelena dropped to her knees, weeping, begging for forgiveness. She had meant no insult. only to find something clean and warm. But mercy had long since died in Ivan IV's heart. In a flash of violence, the Tsar struck her with his staff, once, twice, until blood soaked through her silk. The screams echoed through the palace. Yelena collapsed. Her hands clutched her stomach. Something inside her had torn. The child, the only legitimate heir in the next generation, was dying before it had even breathed. Ivanovich burst into the room, his boots skidding across stone. His wife lay crumpled on the floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Servants froze. Guards looked away. And at the center, his father, red-faced, breathless, stood with the bloody staff still in his hand. There was no time for diplomacy. The prince rushed forward and shouted, "You've killed my wife! You've killed your grandchild!" Ivan the Terrible said nothing. Only the sound of his breathing, wet, irregular, filled the chamber. And then, something broke. It wasn't just a son confronting a father. It was a future confronting its past. A young man whose world had been shaped by brutality, finally pushing back. "You are unfit to rule," he hissed. "You are not a czar. You are a murderer." The words landed like daggers. To Ivan IV, they were not just insults. They were treason. And in that moment, his fear overtook his reason. He roared. He raised the iron-tipped staff high above his head. And with all the weight of wrath and madness, he struck his son. The blow landed squarely on Ivan Ivanovich's skull, just above the right temple. He crumpled. Not like a soldier, like a child. His limbs gave out. His eyes rolled back. Blood poured from his mouth. The silence afterward was worse than the scream. Yelena, despite her pain, crawled to him. Her fingers trembled as she touched his face, already pale, his pulse shallow. The Tsar staggered backward, eyes wide, breath hitched. "My son? My son!" But it was too late. The prince's skull had fractured. Bone splintered inward. The brain swelled rapidly. The body convulsed. The horror was instant and irreversible. Witnesses said the Tsar wailed like a beast, that he ripped at his beard, tore his robes, and begged the icons to forgive him. He ordered relics brought, bones of saints, pieces of the true cross. He placed them on his son's chest. He whispered prayers so frantic they barely made sense. He offered his own life in exchange. But there was no miracle, no heavenly pardon, only the slow, steady collapse of a mind that had finally destroyed what little remained of its own soul. And on that cold November day, the future of Russia bled into the floor, struck down by the hand that once gave it life. The staff hit bone, not once, but hard enough to crack the shell that held Russia's last true hope. Ivan Ivanovich lay sprawled on the cold stone floor, his breath shallow, his pulse faint. The blood flowed freely, thick, black-red. It soaked into his robes, into the carpet, into history itself. His head injury was catastrophic, a compound skull fracture, likely extending across the temporal lobe. The staff, tipped with iron, had not simply bruised. It crushed. Physicians arrived quickly, summoned by desperate screams. But they were powerless. No antiseptics, no surgery, no neuroscience. All they could do was wait and pray. For hours, the prince drifted between life and death. He convulsed. He moaned. His eyes fluttered open, unseeing. Sometimes he called for his wife. Other times, he whispered prayers. His face, once noble, symmetrical, swelled grotesquely. One side bruised purple, the other white as wax. Ivan IV never left his side. Witnesses recall a surreal transformation. The Tsar, who had ruled by terror, was now reduced to a trembling shadow of himself. Kneeling at the foot of the bed, rocking back and forth, muttering the same phrase, "I have murdered my son. I have murdered my son." He tore his clothes. He beat his chest. He demanded the presence of every holy relic in Moscow. Priests were summoned, candles lit. Latin, Greek, and Slavonic chants filled the room like incense, but nothing could cleanse the sin that had been committed. In one desperate act, the Tsar took his staff and shattered it over his knee, breaking the weapon as if to undo what it had done. But the skull would not mend. For 3 days, the prince lingered. He could not eat. He could not speak. His consciousness flickered like a dying flame. Infection set in. His fever spiked. The monks brought relics, bathed him in holy oils, chanted psalms. They placed shrouds of the saints over his chest, wrapped his wrists in cords of martyr's blood. But heaven was silent. The Tsar kissed his son's hands, bloated, limp, and already cold. He begged his forgiveness. He screamed at the physicians to bleed the poison, as if it were merely illness, not the trauma of a father's fury. At one point he struck his own head with a candlestick, shouting, "Let it be me instead!" But no punishment he inflicted upon himself could match the horror he had unleashed. Ivanovich was 27 years old. He had led armies, had studied diplomacy, had been ready, truly ready, to inherit the throne. He was everything Russia needed. And now, he was dying. Not in battle, not by assassin, but at the hand of his father, in his own home. No one dared challenge the Tsar. No arrests, no charges. The court froze in ritual mourning, but beneath the surface they whispered, "Russia is lost." The boyars knew. The clergy knew. Even Ivanovich, in the trembling corner of his conscience, knew. This was no longer just a royal tragedy. It was the beginning of national collapse. On the 4th day, the prince died. The church bells rang, not in celebration, but in horror. Funeral rites began, conducted by patriarchs too afraid to name the truth. Ivan IV refused to leave the body. He sat in silence for hours, stroking his son's hair, speaking to him as if he were still alive. He ordered the burial to be fit for a saint, gilded icons, processions, incense thick as smoke. But no matter how much gold covered the grave, the blood beneath could not be buried. The people mourned, but more than sorrow, there was fear. They knew that with the prince gone, only one male heir remained. Fyodor, weak, sickly, and incapable of rule. The future had been murdered by the past. And now, a power vacuum had opened that would not be filled by mercy or wisdom, but by chaos, famine, impostors, and foreign invasion. In striking his son, Ivan the Terrible did more than commit a crime. He changed the course of Russian history, one blow, and a dynasty began to rot. One moment, and the time of troubles was born. He did not just kill his son. He killed Russia's last true chance at peace. Grief is a strange thing. It comes like a thief, silent, merciless, and always too late. Ivan IV had faced death many times. He had buried wives, friends, ministers, even cities. But this was different. This was his son, his heir, his blood, killed by his own trembling hands. In the hours after Ivan Ivanovich died, the Kremlin became a mausoleum. The walls echoed with nothing but prayers and the hollow sound of regret. The Tsar, once the most feared man in Christendom, was now just a withered father, sitting in silence beside a corpse that still wore the signet of the future Tsar of all Russia. Witnesses say he didn't speak for an entire day. He simply watched, sometimes whispering his son's name, sometimes kissing the bruised hands, sometimes rocking slightly, as if the corpse might wake with enough movement. But the body was cold, and the wound was deep, and the future was gone. Modern forensic historians believe the blow caused a temporal bone fracture, which in turn led to an epidural hematoma, a bleed between the skull and brain lining. This condition compresses the brain rapidly. Within hours, cognitive function collapses. Within days, death is almost certain, especially without surgery, which did not exist in 16th century Russia. But in the 1580s, the people believed not in biology, but in punishment, in divine wrath, in curses. Ivan IV was no exception. He began to believe that God had struck him down through his own hand. He confessed to priests daily. He ordered 7 masses a day in his son's name. He donated gold to monasteries, freed serfs, built churches, all in desperate acts of penance. But guilt clung to him like a second skin. His physical health collapsed. He vomited blood. His limbs shook constantly. He lost teeth. His skin blistered from unknown ailments. Doctors, many of whom were also astrologers and mystics, offered strange remedies: goat's milk baths, leech therapy, even burning his skin to release evil vapors. Nothing worked. His madness returned with a vengeance. He claimed to see the ghost of Ivan Ivanovich walking the palace halls, bleeding, weeping, silent. He stopped sleeping. When he did rest, he slept beside the prince's armor, whispering into it as if it were still warm. Some nights, he screamed so loud, the guards thought assassins had broken in. And yet, in public, he tried to wear the mask of power. He still signed edicts, still held court, still issued decrees. But his voice was cracked, his gaze unfocused, his words often contradictory and tinged with confusion. The boyars took note. The foreign embassies watched in silence. Russia's strong man was unraveling. The church tried to intervene. Patriarchs reminded the Tsar of the doctrine of repentance. But even the fourth didn't want forgiveness. He wanted punishment. At one point, he begged to be flogged publicly during Lent. The clergy, horrified, refused, so he flogged himself in private. And still, nothing could dull the pain. At the funeral, the Tsar gave no speech. He simply stood over the open grave. Then, without warning, he fell to his knees and pressed his forehead against the coffin. "Forgive me," he whispered. "In death, may you forget who I became." Then he wept, not the theatrical weeping of court ritual, but the raw sobbing of a soul cracked in two. No one moved. Not the guards, not the priests, not the nobles. Because in that moment, the man who had ruled Russia with fire and fear was just a father, crushed beneath the weight of his own hands. But regret is not redemption. Ivan continued to rule. But he ruled from the shadows of memory. He kept the prince's room untouched. He spoke to his portraits. He read his letters aloud at court, as if the boy still lived. He even ordered statues of saints carved with the prince's likeness, trying to immortalize what he had destroyed. But nothing could bring back the heir. And every day, as he looked upon his sickly, barely functioning younger son, Fyodor, he knew what Russia had lost. He hadn't just killed his child. He had doomed a nation. For 3 days, the prince fought to stay alive. 3 long, bitter days. His breaths came in shallow gasps, wet, irregular. His pulse danced, then faded. He moaned, not from pain, but from something deeper. Confusion, fear, the unraveling of self. The wound above his temple had turned black. His face was swollen beyond recognition. His lips cracked and bled. At times he seemed lucid, whispering his wife's name. At other times, he stared at the ceiling, his eyes unfocused, as if watching something or someone we could not see. His wife, Yelena, sat at his side, barely recovered from her own injuries, her gown stained with dried blood. Her hands trembling as she dabbed his brow, her prayers hoarse and endless. She had lost their child, and now, inch by inch, she was losing her husband. The Tsar, once the Lion of Russia, had become a ghost in his own palace. He did not command. He did not threaten. He only wept. When physicians told him the truth, that the prince could not be saved, he fell to the floor and screamed. He clawed at the ground. He beat his chest until it bruised. He refused to eat, refused to sleep. All he did was wait. Each hour he would approach his son's bedside, press a relic to his lips, and whisper, "Live, my son, live. Let me take your place." But heaven had gone silent, and death had already entered the room. On the 3rd night, the prince's breathing changed. Slower, deeper, like the body was surrendering. The room grew cold. The nuns lit more candles. The priests knelt and began final rites. Yelena held his hand. Her face, wet with tears, hovered above his. "I love you," she whispered. "Do not fear. I will be with you, always." He tried to speak, but only a wheeze escaped. A tear slid down his bruised cheek. Then he exhaled, long and final. And Ivan Ivanovich, heir to the Tsardom of Russia, died. He was 27. No scream came from the Tsar, no rage, no collapse, only silence. And then a whisper, "I am no longer a father." He kissed the prince's forehead, then turned away. The priests covered the body. The guards stepped back. The nation, though not yet told, had already begun to tremble. When the death was announced, the Kremlin bells rang, not in triumph, but in mourning. From Novgorod to Kazan, the people wept, not just for the prince, but for what he represented. He was their hope, the calm after the storm, the mind that might have tamed the crown's cruelty. And now, he was gone. Russia was left with a father who had destroyed the son meant to save it, and a younger brother, Fyodor, feeble-minded, sickly, incapable of rule. A void had opened in the very heart of the empire, and into that void, darkness would fall. The funeral of Ivan Ivanovich was the grandest since his mother's. The coffin, crafted of cedar and inlaid with gold, was carried through the streets by silent guards. Monks chanted psalms, nobles wept openly, peasants threw flowers beneath the path. But the Tsar walked alone, his robes torn, his face sunken, his eyes hollow. He followed the casket like a condemned man, walking behind his own execution. At the Cathedral of the Archangel, the body was laid to rest beside long-dead princes, men who had built Russia with swords and law. And now, the one who could have restored her soul was lowered into the earth. There were no final words, no great eulogy, only the sound of earth falling, thud by thud, on the coffin of a prince. A crown can endure steel, fire, even blood. But what it cannot survive is emptiness. With Ivan Ivanovich buried, the Russian throne, once feared and revered, stood hollow. The man meant to inherit it was gone, and in his place, a silence that would echo for decades. Ivan the Terrible, though still alive, was no longer a ruler. He was a relic, broken, half-mad, muttering prayers to a god he feared had abandoned him. And all that remained between Russia and anarchy was Fyodor Ivanovich, the younger son. A quiet, soft-eyed man, pious, gentle, sickly. But he was no czar. He could barely speak in public, could not lead armies, feared thunder, suffered from chronic illness, seizures, and what modern historians suspect was either autism or significant intellectual disability. The boyars knew it. The clergy whispered it. Even Ivan IV knew it. And that may have been his cruelest punishment, to witness the future he had allowed survive, and realize it could not rule. Fyodor was crowned in 1584, after Ivan the Terrible finally died, aged, decaying, and consumed by regret. His death was quiet, his burial grand. But his ghost loomed large over the empire. Russia held its breath. The people hoped. Perhaps Fyodor would be guided by strong advisors. Perhaps the church could hold the realm together. But what followed was collapse. Without Ivan Ivanovich, there was no legitimate warrior prince to unite the court, no heir to command loyalty from the fractured nobility, no voice to silence foreign powers eyeing Russia's borders like vultures circling a dying beast. Within a year, rebellions flared. Peasants starved. The treasury bled gold. Neighboring empires tested Russia's defenses and found them wanting. Worst of all, the issue of succession had become a battlefield. Dozens claimed to be miraculously alive versions of the dead prince. Impostors wearing false scars, speaking in courtly tones, pretending to be Ivan Ivanovich, returned from exile. They were called the false Dimitris, and they would plunge the empire into madness. One of them, backed by Polish nobles, would even take Moscow itself. Another would be crowned, and another would be lynched in Red Square. His eyes gouged, his tongue cut out, his corpse burned and shot from a cannon. And all of it could be traced back to a single blow, a single moment. When the father killed the future. The period that followed is known in Russian history as the Time of Troubles, a dark age of famine, war, invasion, civil strife, and dynastic chaos. It lasted nearly 2 decades. Millions died. Cities were burned. The royal bloodline of Rurik, which had ruled Russia for over 700 years, collapsed with Fyodor's death in 1598. He left no heir, no will, no clarity, only silence. and ashes. What made this tragedy so unbearable was how preventable it had been. Ivan Ivanovich had been everything Russia needed. Educated in both religion and law, a commander respected by his troops, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Church Slavonic, diplomatic, decisive, charismatic. But he had also been a son raised under tyranny, and in the end, even he could not escape the shadow of his father's paranoia. Dynasties do not end in war. They end in doubt, in vacuum, in betrayal from within. And when Ivan IV raised his hand that day, not against an enemy, but against his own son, he did not just strike flesh. He struck the heart of the Rurikid line. He shattered Russia's fragile order. He ensured that the land he had built with terror would drown in it after him. The Tsardom would recover eventually under a new dynasty, the Romanovs. But the scars never truly healed. Even centuries later, Russian rulers would invoke the name Ivan the Terrible, not as honor, but as warning. He died without a crown, but his absence ruled Russia more profoundly than his life ever could. For in losing him, Russia lost itself. To understand why Ivan the Terrible murdered his own son, we must dissect not the blow, but the mind that delivered it. This is not an autopsy of the body. This is an autopsy of the soul. Ivan IV was not born a madman. He was born into chaos. His father poisoned when Ivan was just 3. His mother dead by 8, likely also poisoned. And in the power vacuum that followed, the boy prince became a puppet to warring noble families who beat, starved, and humiliated him. From those shattered years came 3 enduring traits: paranoia, abandonment complex, absolute mistrust. Modern psychiatrists might diagnose Ivan with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. The signs were clear. Violent mood swings, obsessive fear of betrayal, inability to form stable emotional attachments, a warped view of punishment as purification. He craved love but struck those who gave it. He feared loss but destroyed what he feared losing. In his youth, Ivan showed signs of brilliance. He convened a Zemsky Sobor, National Assembly, codified laws, and sought to centralize state power. But with every step forward came a lurch into darkness. His wife, Anastasia Romanovna, was one of the few people who grounded him. When she died suddenly in 1560, something inside him snapped. He blamed boyars, clergy, anyone, convinced she had been poisoned. Historians believe this was the tipping point, the moment when grief metastasized into delusion. He launched the Oprichnina soon after, a reign of terror, black-robed enforcers, massacres in Novgorod, the public flaying of nobles, the murder of children, pregnant women, entire towns. Yet amidst the carnage, Ivan still saw himself as a just ruler. He believed he was purging evil, purifying Russia with fire and blood. This moral paradox, believing himself righteous while committing atrocities, is textbook delusional psychosis. Beyond trauma, Ivan's body was also betraying him. For decades, he ingested mercury, used in 16th century Russia as a treatment for chronic pain and humoral imbalances. His bones, when examined centuries later, showed toxic levels of the substance. Symptoms of mercury poisoning align with Ivan's condition. Tremors, rage outbursts, visual and auditory hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive deterioration. He also suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, noted in contemporary accounts of sudden collapses, visions of angels, and unprovoked attacks. His brain quite literally was on fire. So why his son? Why Ivan Ivanovich? Because love was the most terrifying thing of all. The prince represented everything Ivan IV had lost. Innocence, rationality, stability, the hope of legacy. To the Tsar's fractured mind, this wasn't a son. It was a mirror, and what he saw in it was failure. He feared that his son judged him, that the boy might remove him, that he would be replaced, not in death, but in disgrace. And so, in a moment of pure psychosis, he lashed out. To kill the fear, he killed its source. After the prince's death, Ivan IV deteriorated rapidly. He hallucinated constantly, believed the devil lived inside his bloodstream, ordered exorcisms, slept with relics, screamed the names of his dead wife and son into the night. He confessed his sins to priests almost daily, but never stopped punishing himself. One monk wrote, "He scourges his own back until it bleeds. He fasts until he faints. He speaks of God, then curses the saints. He is man and monster in one body." And yet, some part of him knew what he had done. In his final days, he asked to be buried in monk's robes, not as Tsar, but as a penitent, a man who had conquered nations, built cathedrals, destroyed cities, and still could not defeat the monster in his own mind. This was not just the death of a prince. It was the slow-motion suicide of an empire, and all of it rooted in the unhealed wounds of a boy who became a Tsar and died a father, haunted by the son he could not love without fear. He ruled for half a century. He outlived his enemies. He crushed cities, redrew maps, and forged the tsardom of Russia from blood and ash. But in the end, Ivan the Terrible could not outrun his curse. Not one carved in spell or prophecy, but the curse born from his own hands. He killed his son, and with that one act, murdered Russia's future. After Ivan Ivanovich died, the Tsar wandered his halls like a soul unburied. He stopped holding court for days, refused food, clung to icons until his fingers bled. At night, he claimed to hear voices whispering from the cathedral walls, voices that spoke in the tones of his son. He wrote no more music, issued no more poetry, only edicts. Cruel, confused, contradictory. The man who once burned entire towns with a sentence now forgot the names of his advisors. He sat in rooms with no light. He prayed, not for Russia, but for oblivion. He died on March 28, 1584. Not in battle, not by assassin's blade, but slumped over a chessboard, clutching a relic in one hand and a list of enemies in the other. No final declaration, no imperial blessing, just the slow, unremarkable extinguishing of a man who once believed himself chosen by God. He was buried in Moscow's Cathedral of the Archangel, beside the very son he had slain. 2 stone coffins, 1 legacy, and between them, centuries of silence. Fyodor, his only remaining son, ruled in name alone. Within 15 years, the Rurikid dynasty, the bloodline of princes stretching back to the age of Vikings, was gone. Replaced not by strength, but by shadows. The time of troubles followed. A famine that killed 1/3 of the population, civil wars and false claimants, foreign invasion, and national humiliation. It would take the rise of the Romanovs in 1613 to finally bring stability. But even they ruled with a ghost behind them. The story of Ivan and his son haunted every palace. Every father who raised a child to rule remembered. Every czar who feared betrayal saw a reflection in the cracked mirror of that legacy. What, then, was Ivan's true curse? Not madness, not bloodshed, not cruelty, but the knowledge, at the very end, that everything he had built was destroyed by his own failure to love. He was brilliant. He was brutal. But he was never free. Free from fear, free from grief, free from the ghosts of his childhood that whispered, "Strike first or be struck." In trying to protect Russia from betrayal, he became betrayal itself. In trying to create a legacy of iron, he left one of ash. And in killing his son, he created a wound so deep it bled through generations. There is a legend told by old monks. On storm-filled nights, the Tsar's soul wanders the stone halls of the Kremlin, whispering his son's name, seeking the mercy he denied in life. Whether true or not, one thing remains. His story is not one of empire. It is a father's curse, and that curse is that history never forgets the hand that killed its own heart. Bludgeoned by a father, buried with a nation's hope. Ivan Ivanovich, the prince that might have saved Russia. History is not always shaped on the battlefield. Sometimes it is forged in a quiet room, between two people bound by blood. The tragedy of Ivan the Terrible and his son is not merely the fall of a dynasty, but a harrowing testament to how unchecked power, unhealed trauma, and the corrosive grip of paranoia can destroy both family and nation. It is a warning, not only to rulers, but to anyone who lets fear and rage speak louder than love and reason. In the death of Prince Ivan, we don't just witness the collapse of an empire. We see ourselves, what we become when pain governs judgment, and when the hand meant to protect becomes the blade that ends everything.